You don't belong in this room. That was the first sentence I heard when I stepped inside the oak-paneled office. Not a greeting. Not a condolence. Just that spat like ash from my father's mouth. The room was colder than I remembered. Perhaps it was the absence of my grandfather's presence. Or perhaps it was the way Serafina sat with her legs crossed and back arched, wearing grief like a tailored coat. I stood unwelcome, in a place that used to smell like peppermint tea and books, now soured by legal ink and old grudges. Warren didn't rise from the leather chair. He just gestured at the chair opposite him, like a judge offering a noose. My mother Eleanor sat beside him, her hands folded too neatly in her lap, eyes vacant as if watching a funeral that happened years ago. And there, at the head of the table, was Mr. Harlan, the family lawyer. His gray suit blended with the walls. His mouth was a straight line, as if even syllables weighed too much to lift. "We're here to honor Julian's final wishes," he began. The word honor caught in my chest like a splinter. Julian was my grandfather. He raised me when the others left me to be raised by silence and shadows. While Serafina went to boarding schools and ballet academies, I stayed in Oregon with him, planting, reading, building birdhouses, learning how to listen to the world when no one listens to you. To Serafina, Harlan read, I bequeath the sum of $10 million, the estate at Blackridge, and all assets tied to my holding accounts. Sarah didn't even blink. She just smiled like someone who had memorized her lines. To Iris, he paused. That pause was a scalpel. I leave my gratitude. The words landed like frostbite. Sudden. Numb. Final. My gratitude. A silence fell so thick it rang in my ears. Warren cleared his throat, but it sounded more like a chuckle. Eleanor didn't move. Not a flinch. This is absurd, I whispered. Is it? Serafina turned toward me, eyes wide with pity so sharp it sliced. I mean, you never really contributed, Iris. You ran off to play gardener while the rest of us built real legacies. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find the breath. Mr. Harlan folded the papers with clinical detachment. Unless there are objections, this concludes the reading of the will. I rose. My knees didn't want to. My hands shook. But I stood. I object, I said. Quiet. Measured. But the room tilted like gravity had turned on me. Warren chuckled aloud this time. You're welcome to object, Iris. Just not in this family. That was the moment I realized I hadn't lost an inheritance. I'd been erased. I didn't cry. Not there. Not then. I simply walked out, my hands empty but my mind ablaze. Because deep inside something cracked open. Not grief. Not even rage. But the whisper of something older. A voice I hadn't heard in years. My grandfather's voice. And it said, Not yet, child. Not yet. Your grandfather passed peacefully last Thursday. The funeral was private. The woman at the front desk said it without blinking, like she was announcing the weather. I stood there, in my wool coat still damp from Oregon rain, mouth slightly parted, as if I'd missed a step and was still falling. I hadn't been told. No call. No message. No obituary. No room to grieve. Just absence. Again. I had been erased from his death, too. Julian had raised me with hands rough from soil and heart tender from loss. He never spoke ill of my parents, never tried to fill the void they left, only tended to the parts of me they'd neglected. Every summer, every Christmas, every lost tooth or science fair ribbon, he was there. And now he was gone. Without me. I left the law office in a daze. The streets outside were loud, indifferent. The sky had turned a brittle shade of gray. In the diner across from the courthouse, I scrolled through Serafina's social media like a woman digging through rubble. There it was. A photo of her in a black dress, perfectly composed, beside a casket draped in white lilies. Farewell, Julian. We carry your legacy. Legacy. The word burned. She hadn't carried a damn thing. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered. Miss Iris. Yes. My name is Evelyn Monroe. I was Mr. Julian's estate attorney. Not the one from the reading. The real one. I straightened up. My heartbeat wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to something ancient. He asked me to give you this. Personally. Not to your parents. Not to anyone else. Just you. A pause. It's a wooden box. He said you'd understand. I met her outside an old cafe that smelled of citrus and ink. She was older than I expected, her hands weathered like driftwood, her eyes sharp. The box was small, smooth, and worn at the edges. She handed it to me like a ritual, not a delivery. He said to tell you, not everything that matters is written in ink. I took it. Inside, under a velvet cloth, was a folded letter and a small brass key. The letter began with 4 words that shattered the ice around my heart. I never forgot you. The box was heavier than it looked. Not in weight, but in meaning. I sat in my tiny apartment, the scent of rain-soaked soil clinging to the air, the box in front of me like a puzzle only grief could solve. I opened it slowly. Inside, a folded letter in my grandfather's handwriting, and a small brass key with a faded ribbon tied around it. The kind of key that once opened something sacred. A locked box? A drawer? A forgotten door? I ran my fingers over the script on the envelope. To Iris. When the noise becomes too loud, follow the quiet. I unfolded the letter and read, My dearest Iris, if you're reading this, it means the world has done what the world does, buried the soft and praised the sharp. I tried to shield you, but I cannot protect you from everything. So instead I left you this. The start of something your own. Not on paper, not in numbers, but in soil, in silence, in growth. The key belongs to the greenhouse behind the old barn, not the new one, the one I built with your hands in mind. You were always more than they could see. And this is the seed of your truth. My breath caught. That old greenhouse had been locked for years. I thought it was abandoned, a ruin, just like me. I went the same night. The wind in Oregon sang like ghosts when you listen closely. The path was overgrown, branches clawing at my coat like forgotten warnings. But when I reached the barn and stepped behind it, there it was, the old greenhouse. Glass cracked like veins across time, ivy climbing the frame like nature trying to pull it back. I pushed the key into the rusted lock. It resisted, then gave way with a sigh, like it had been waiting. Inside, everything smelled like memory, wood, damp earth, a faint trace of peppermint, and in the center, beneath a tarp, I found something astonishing. A metal cabinet, locked. I opened it. Inside were journals, dozens. My grandfather's writing, every page filled with observations, sketches, names of rare plants, climate experiments, notes about healing herbs, meditation, sustainability, natural therapy, but at the very bottom, a manila folder marked, The Iris Project. I opened it. Inside were legal documents, a trust fund, a land deed, a mission statement, all in my name. My heart pounded. This was no accident. While the family chased gold and marble and Blackridge estates, he had built a kingdom in dirt and light just for me. And no one else knew. Not yet. You're back. I thought you'd finally learned your place. Those were the first words Warren said when he saw me on the porch of the family estate. He didn't look surprised. Displeased, yes. Annoyed, certainly. But surprised? Not even slightly. Serafina stood a step behind him, her arms crossed, her silk blouse too crisp for a house in mourning. The sun framed her like a portrait, flawless and distant. I'm not here to reclaim anything, I said, steady. I'm here for answers. His eyes narrowed the way a lion regards a thorn. Answers, he scoffed, stepping aside without inviting me in. You've had decades to ask. And you've had decades to lie. We didn't speak in words anymore. We spoke in wounds. The house hadn't changed. Same mahogany floors. Same scent of lavender and cold marble. But now every surface seemed polished by resentment. In the sitting room, Eleanor waited, perched on the edge of the armchair like a ghost still deciding whether to haunt or leave. Mother, I said. She flinched. Just slightly. But I saw it. Iris, she whispered. Her voice was air. You erased me from his funeral. She looked away. Warren chuckled, pouring himself a drink like we were discussing stock portfolios. Don't act like it was personal, he said. You weren't part of the legacy. That word again. Legacy. Like it was a fortress I never got the keys to. Grandpa raised me while you were off chasing IPOs and image consultants, I snapped. He was more than legacy. He was home. Warren's smile turned thin. Asterisk, he was weak. Too sentimental. That garden of his? A waste of land. My fists clenched. But I didn't come here to fight. I came to reveal. I know about the greenhouse, I said. Quietly. Deliberately. That got their attention. Serafina blinked. Warren paused mid-sip. What greenhouse? The one he built with his own hands. The one with a trust fund you can't touch. The air froze. You think you found some secret will? Warren hissed, voice low and dangerous. Don't play games you can't win. I'm not playing anymore, I said. I'm planting. The room tilted. Not literally, but power shifted. For the first time, I wasn't the girl they dismissed. I was the storm they underestimated. Serafina looked at me differently. Not with disdain, but something else. Something quieter. Regret. I didn't return to the house. I returned to the land. To the earth still wet with winter. The trees still bare. The greenhouse still hidden behind rows of overgrown hedges. The same greenhouse my grandfather and I used to sneak into with flashlights when I was little, pretending we were exploring ancient ruins. The key fit perfectly into the rusted lock. Clicked like a memory. The door creaked open, slow and reluctant, like the building itself had forgotten the warmth of welcome. Inside, time had grown wild. Ivy crawled across the windows. Dust clung to every glass jar and forgotten tool. But beneath it all, I felt his presence. Not as a ghost. As intention. A single desk sat at the center. Not covered in dirt. Not abandoned like the rest. On it, a folder marked in my grandfather's handwriting. The Iris Project. The air shifted. I wasn't trespassing anymore. I had come home. Inside the folder were schematics, maps, plant profiles, and detailed notes. Plans for a sanctuary garden. A healing center rooted in native plants, sustainable living, and a philosophy of patience. At the bottom, a sealed envelope with my name. I opened it. If you're reading this, Iris, they've tried to bury more than just my body. This place, this dream was never meant for profit. It was meant for people. For you. I left them the money. But I left you the future. Tears came not because I was sad, but because something in me had been remembered. I turned around. Behind the desk, behind a false wall covered in vines, was a small safe. The key, still warm from my pocket, opened it. Inside, documents for a trust. A private land title in my name. A small but sufficient endowment. And one note. Grow it slow. Grow it true. I sat there for hours. Reading. Breathing. Letting the soil settle around the pieces of myself that had been scattered. Because this wasn't just a garden. It was proof. Proof that he saw me. Not as someone who failed to win legacy, but as someone who was always meant to carry it differently. The first time I saw their faces twist wasn't at the funeral. It was here when they realized something had slipped from their grip. We were in the same room again. The same oak walls. The same leather chairs. But the air was different. This time I had the papers. Mr. Whitaker, the lawyer my grandfather actually trusted, stood beside me. He was calm, clinical, sharp as a scalpel. The antithesis of Mr. Harlan. Warren looked annoyed to be summoned. Eleanor appeared as if she'd rather be anywhere else. Serafina, though, she was curious. Not nervous. Not yet. I wanted to inform you, I began, that I'll be taking full possession of the greenhouse and surrounding land, as per the deeds my grandfather signed before his passing. Warren raised a brow. That property belongs to the family estate. I smiled. No. It doesn't. Mr. Whitaker stepped forward, placing documents on the table like chess moves. These were filed months before Julian's health declined. A trust in Iris's name. It supersedes any claim from the will read earlier. Serafina blinked. Just once. A small crack. Eleanor's fingers twitched. Warren stood up. This is preposterous. Julian was manipulated. He wasn't, Whitaker interrupted. And you do well not to insult the man's capacity without evidence. Warren glared at me. So what now? You plan to turn that rotting shed into some hippie retreat? No, Iraplia. Into something real. Something that lives. Like he did. They didn't laugh. That was the best part. They didn't mock me. They were quiet. Because they understood something. The real inheritance wasn't measured in zeros. It was in being seen, being chosen, and for the first time in a long while I felt both. We're reclaiming what was stolen. That's what Warren told the press. Not what was rightfully ours. Not what was mismanaged. Stolen. As if Julian, even in death, was a thief. The news hit me over morning coffee, the headline blinking like a threat. Blackridge estate faces legal challenge from heirs. My hands tightened around the cup. Not with fear. With clarity. I had underestimated how deep my father's greed ran. Warren had filed a suit through a shell company, Glenmore Investments, claiming that Julian lacked mental capacity when creating the Iris Trust. The case argued that the greenhouse land had been improperly distributed and held sentimental value to the family. They wanted the land, the plants, the roots, everything. They're trying to rip out what he planted, I told Mr. Avery, Julian's real lawyer. No, he said, eyes steady. They're trying to bury what they can't control. The lawsuit wasn't just legal, it was public. Tabloids printed half-truths. Anonymous family sources whispered lies about Julian's erratic final years. Pictures of me in the garden alone were splashed next to headlines questioning my motives. But I stayed quiet, not weak, strategic, because I had something they didn't. Time. I began rebuilding the greenhouse. Slowly, deliberately. Every pot I placed felt like a prayer, a rebellion of roots. Then came the letter from the zoning board. Glenmore Investments was filing to rezone the land, to flatten the garden for commercial use. My inheritance wasn't just under attack, it was to be erased again, this time by bulldozers. That night, I walked the garden under moonlight. I knelt by a blooming iris and whispered, I will not let them win. But even as I prepared for battle, I felt it, a fracture in the plan, a hesitation, not from me, from someone else. The silence in the Blackridge estate was different now. It wasn't the cold silence of power asserting itself, but the unsettling stillness of guilt. Serafina wandered the halls like a guest in her own triumph. The chandelier light didn't gleam as brightly. The paintings of ancestors stared too long, and every polished surface reflected her face back with questions she couldn't answer. In her hand was a glass of wine untouched. In her phone was a draft email unsent. The subject line, confidential Blackridge acquisition. It was an email she wasn't meant to see. Her father had left his tablet unlocked in the library 3 nights ago. She hadn't intended to snoop, but curiosity, or perhaps a growing unease, pushed her fingers to scroll. And what she read shattered the last shield she had. We finalize the rezoning permits next quarter. Iris won't stand a chance. The media spin will focus on environmental upgrades. PR already briefed. Erasing the greenhouse is the final step. That line, it had pierced something dormant in her. Serafina remembered the greenhouse. She remembered being 10, sitting with Iris under the old fig tree, laughing as Julian taught them how to propagate lavender. That memory had faded over the years, but it hadn't died. Her father was trying to bury more than just land. He was erasing a lineage of love, memory, and truth. She stared at the draft email again. It was addressed to Iris's lawyer, still unsent. Her finger hovered over send. No one would know. She could delete it, go back to her life of charity galas, magazine spreads, and carefully curated sorrow. But then again, what was the point of legacy if it came wrapped in lies? Her heart beat louder than the silence. Her breath felt like confession. She pressed send, and for the first time in years she felt weightless. Not free but less caged. The email was old, dated 2 years before Julian's death. It bore Warren's digital signature, a forwarded thread with zoning plans, bribes to councilmen, and a line that chilled the spine. Once he's gone, we break ground. Serafina stared at it for hours. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she did. She found it in her archive while looking for something entirely different. Or so she told herself. Maybe she was always meant to find it. Or maybe guilt doesn't knock, it seeps. Warren's plan was meticulous. Acquire the garden land after contesting Julian's will, destroy the greenhouse, and build a boutique vineyard resort with Sarah as its public face. Her name was on the mock-ups. She was supposed to be the pretty mask over the rot. And yet, that mask now felt like acid on her skin. She remembered Iris's face at the will reading. Not angry, not bitter, just hollowed out. Like a ghost watching her own funeral. That night, Serafina couldn't sleep. The villa's silk sheets felt like restraints. She walked barefoot across cold marble floors, down into the wine cellar where Warren stored his best-kept secrets. She printed the email, one copy, then slid it into a padded envelope. She didn't write a return address. She didn't need to. The next morning, the envelope was delivered to Iris's lawyer. No name, no note, just truth. That afternoon, as Warren stood before reporters claiming Julian had been mentally compromised, Iris's lawyer filed a motion in court and submitted Exhibit A, the email. Warren's face collapsed on live television. His empire cracked, not with a bang, but a single pixelated truth. Serafina watched it all unfold on a muted screen, then turned it off. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. For the first time in years, the breath didn't burn. The courtroom was silent, not because the verdict was unexpected, but because some victories don't arrive with applause. They settle like fog, quiet, thick, unmistakable. The judge's gavel struck wood with finality. The court rules in favor of Iris Vale. The trust, property, and associated assets remain hers by right. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice. I didn't smile. I didn't weep. I just exhaled for the first time in weeks, maybe months. Across the room, Warren stood frozen. A man built on control, now watching his empire fracture. Not from an earthquake but from a crack he made long ago and refused to seal. Eleanor sat behind him, eyes low, fingers twisting the hem of her scarf. She didn't speak. And then there was Sarah. She hadn't looked at me throughout the trial. But when the gavel fell, her eyes found mine. Not in confrontation. Not in guilt. Something more complicated. Like she had just seen herself in a mirror and finally recognized the cracks. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Lawyers shook hands. I passed through them like a shadow, stepping into sunlight that didn't feel like fire anymore. At the edge of the crowd, Sarah was waiting. "Congratulations," she said softly. "Why?" I asked, not out of bitterness but truth. "You gave me what you never wanted me to have." She didn't flinch. "I gave you what I couldn't live without giving." That was the closest she could come to saying sorry. And maybe that was enough. We stood there, two sisters no longer defined by inheritance or expectation. After a pause, I reached into my bag and handed her a sealed envelope. Her brows furrowed. "What's this?" "A letter Grandpa wrote," I said. "Not about money. About you. He never gave up on you, Sarah. He just didn't know how to save someone who didn't want to be found." She held the envelope like it was fire. Maybe it was. I turned to leave. "You're still angry," she called after me. I stopped, looked back. "No," I said. "Just done." Because peace doesn't come when the war is over. It comes when you stop letting your wounds define the battlefield. I used to believe that revenge looked like thunder, that it needed to be loud, merciless, public. I used to imagine them on their knees, begging for forgiveness I'd never grant. But instead I found myself standing in the center of the greenhouse barefoot, surrounded by sprigs of new life. Revenge didn't look like war. It looked like stillness. The glass ceiling shimmered with sunlight. Vines crept along the corners like quiet witnesses to a resurrection. And in the middle of it all, the Iris Project bloomed, an oasis built from the very soil they once tried to erase me from. There were no cameras. No applause. No retribution that would trend on the internet. Only peace. Visitors came. Survivors of grief. Children with traumas too big for their age. Veterans whose hearts were louder than their words. They didn't come for revenge. They came to remember how to breathe again. And in helping them heal, I found my own wounds softening. The bitterness faded like morning mist. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in molten gold, I sat beside the pond grandfather once built. I whispered to him, though he wasn't there, not in body. "You were right," I said. "The real inheritance was never money. It was this." The silence answered with a breeze that rustled the leaves. A kind of benediction. Later that night, I found a letter on the doorstep. No name, just an old envelope. Inside, a note written in Sarah's familiar cursive. "You were brave enough to sow. I'm trying to learn how to water." It wasn't an apology. It was a beginning. And that's when I realized, The truest revenge is not making them suffer. It's thriving so profoundly, they become irrelevant. I stop needing them to hurt. I stop needing them to understand. Because peace is not the absence of pain. It's the presence of something deeper. A choice to live forward. The garden was no longer just a garden. Where once stood cracked pathways and overgrown thorns, now bloomed rows of lavender, medicinal herbs, and young trees swaying like dancers in early morning wind. The air smelled of mint, cedar, and quiet redemption. Iris knelt by a newly planted sapling. She didn't speak to it. She simply pressed the soil down with careful hands, palms steady, breath calm. A life ago, her hands trembled with rage. Now they nurtured. Children's laughter echoed from the greenhouse. A group of volunteers, some recovering addicts, some former foster kids, were painting signs with the names of plants and places. One of them waved at her through the window. She smiled softly, then stood, brushing dirt off her jeans. Her once brittle spine now held a different kind of strength. In the mailbox at the garden's entrance was a single postcard. No return address. No message. Just an image of a sprouting seed, barely breaking through soil. And beneath it, in faint handwriting, "I'm learning to plant too. S." Iris stared at the card for a long moment. Her sister's name wasn't needed. The handwriting was enough. She pressed the card to her heart. A breeze moved through the garden like a hush. And then she walked back inside. Back into the greenhouse where seedlings waited. Where healing was no longer a hope, but a rhythm. Where revenge had transformed into a lesson. Where justice had taken root and grown into peace.